Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Science Communication, A Visual Perspective, with Yael Fitzpatrick. This talk is hosted by the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook University. The Alda Center empowers scientists, medical professionals, and researchers to communicate their work clearly and vividly to all audiences. Thank you for joining us. A little bit about our speaker this afternoon. Yael Fitzpatrick is an art director, publications designer, sometimes writer, and science communicator. She spent the first part of her life concentrating on math and the sciences, and then took an unexpected detour into the arts. She is the former art director for the Science family of journals and manager of design and branding for the American Geophysical Union. Yael now runs Gazelle Design Consultancy, specializing in art direction, design, and brand management for the scientific and scholarly publishing space. I'm going to hand it over to her to get started. Yael, thank you so much for joining us today. We're so delighted to have you here.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And I'd like to say a special thank you to the Alda Center and the Kavli Foundation for making this webinar possible. And a special thanks to Radha Ganesan and Jamie Knight for all of your tireless work behind the scenes. And a huge thanks to everybody who is watching for your time and your interest. I love science and I love design, so having an opportunity to talk about them both with you makes for a pretty good day. So I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you today. Some of it's going to be just kind of nuts and bolts practical information. Some of it's going to be a little bit more conceptual. And I hope that you might learn something new. And I hope that you might have an opportunity to think visually in ways that you might not have done previously. But to start out, I want to ask everybody a question. And it might seem like a bit of a silly question, but it's something that I have found that people have really strong opinions about. And I will be the first to admit that I am one of those people that has really strong opinions about. The question is, how many spaces should there be after a period? So we're going to share a poll, and I would ask that everybody answer the poll question, and we'll come back to it a little bit later on and discuss it. But for now, let's get started. So I want to start with just the big question of why. Why do we want to think about design at all? I think that most people would agree that design can be a nice thing, that it can be great to have things look good, that aesthetics can be pleasant, but it goes so much deeper than that when you're talking about design, when you're talking about graphic design, when you're talking about design for scholarly communication. The fact is, quite simply, that design matters. When graphic design is done well, it supports and enables better conversation and communication. Conversely, when it's done poorly, it really hinders communication. The best example that I've ever come across to demonstrate this is the design, or in this case, the bad design, of the infamous butterfly ballot that was used in Florida during the 2000 general election. Now, in this case, bad design arguably changed the outcome of a United States presidential election. Design matters, and it communicates, and it engages. But there is a bit of a paradox when it comes to thinking about design. And the paradox is this. Graphic design is a visual medium, but one that is often most successful when its presence is invisible. With things like sculpture or painting, the final visual product is the takeaway message. With graphic design, the content is the takeaway. The design really needs to be an invisible structure underneath that, supporting that content, but not drawing too much attention to itself. Keep in mind that accuracy matters, especially for scientific communication. I think we all know and agree that accuracy is important in science, in the writing. It's important in the visuals as well, even in ways that might seem very slight. but it becomes very insidious if you're not being accurate. Accuracy can reflect poorly on you, or it can reflect favorably on you. If you need to have a dash, make sure that it's an M dash instead of a hyphen when appropriate. If you're showing DNA, make sure it's twisting the right way. Small little things like that aren't so small when they add up. And when, if they're done in error visually, they slightly and insidiously undermine your overall credibility and your overall messaging. All right, with that as some background, where to begin? What I recommend for beginning with how to think about visual communication is the same as for a lot of communication in general, by asking yourself two questions. What's the message? Who is the audience? This is something that you can ask yourself at the beginning, throughout the entire process, and even at the end of your project work, to make sure that what you've hit is the right mark. Asking yourself these questions, thinking carefully about the answers, will really inform the way that you're presenting your communication visually. All right, let's get to some of those practical nuts and bolts things that I talked about. Or what I like to think of as, just because you can doesn't mean you should. There are a lot of very tempting, compelling tools and tricks out there. But for a lot of design, and especially for design for scholarly and scientific content, a lot of those little tools and tricks are probably things that you should steer clear of. Now, leave it to the onion to put this into the best possible concise light. This goes back to the idea that I mentioned earlier, that for design, and especially for design for scientific communication, you want the design to be a transparent understructure that doesn't call attention to itself. When you do things that are too flashy, that are too out there visually, you're calling attention to the design and drawing attention away from the content, which is what should be front and center. Let's look at some basic tips about typography. Generally speaking, don't use text that is outlined. Don't use cutesy typefaces like Comic Sans or like Papyrus. Now, I'm gonna pick on Comic Sans for a moment here. A lot of people love Comic Sans. Comic Sans is friendly and it's casual and it's approachable. Comic Sans is the sweatpants of the typographic world. Would you ever go to an important meeting wearing sweatpants? Of course not. The way that you present yourself reflects on you and reflects on your message. The way that you present yourself visually in your communications does the same thing. So go with more traditional typefaces, ones that don't call too much attention to themselves. I often am asked if it's better to use serif text or sans serif text. Serif being the kinds that have little nubs at the ends of the letter form, sans serif being without. Times New Roman is an example of a serif typeface, whereas Helvetica is an example of a sans serif. Conventional wisdom generally says that for long narrative text, serif text is better because it gives you a way of having the eye kind of follow along on the line. There are some people that argue with that. Online, more and more people are using sans serif. So just be conscious of different options and what your applications are going to be. Whatever typefaces you do go with though, I do recommend limiting yourself to no more than 2, or in some cases, maybe 3 typefaces. Now keep in mind that a typeface is not the same as a font. Those terms are sometimes used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. A typeface is an entire family, whereas a font is one member of that family. So for instance, say you're using Adobe Garamond as your typeface. Adobe Garamond is the entire family, whereas Adobe Garamond Bold Italic is one font within that typeface. So when I'm saying that you can have 2 or maybe 3 typefaces, that still gives you a lot of different options, a lot of different fonts that are in your arsenal that you can utilize. Okay, let's talk about line length for a minute here. Now, oftentimes you will be faced with some kind of formatting restrictions. Things like NSF grant proposals are famous for this. They are things that need machine readers where certain restrictions for formatting are necessary. And I understand that, and I'm not going to try to convince anybody not to go with specific guidelines that you're meant to use. Unfortunately, with some of these guidelines, they're great for the overall proposal process, but you can end up with a line length that is really much too long to be easily read. If you have the option, I recommend that a good rule of thumb is to have around 65 characters per line, and that includes spaces. That is pretty much an optimal line length to let your eye kind of track across a line of text. It's not so short that it becomes choppy. It's not so long that the eye kind of falls off and has a hard time following along. In all of your visuals, strive for cohesion, whether that be through typography, through color, through imagery. The more that you can be visually cohesive in what you present, the more you're going to present a polished and professional package, and that in turn is going to reflect very favorably on you and on the work that you're presenting. Where you can, introduce visual hierarchy. Now, that's just a fancy way of saying tools that help a reader guide their eye to take in the content in the order in which you desire. Sometimes you're going to have no choice but just to have massive blocks of text. But in that case, are there things that you can do to break things up a little bit, to have a little bit of kind of a visual respite? Pull quotes can be a great way of doing this. Imagery can be a great way of doing this. Okay, we're going to get into the weeds just for a minute here, because I wanted to go over some technical issues. There are a lot of terms that people might have heard, but they might not know exactly what they mean, what to use when, and sometimes people are a little bit shy in asking. So just wanted to go through some basics here. You might have heard of CMYK or RGB. CMYK and RGB are probably the two most common color spaces, and what that means is color languages. CMYK is a color space that's used for print, whereas RGB is a color space that's used for digital or online. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and the K stands for black. And it's the four colors of ink that are used in traditional offset printing to produce what we think of as full color. RGB is for red, green, and blue light, which are the three colors of light that are combined to create all of the colors in the spectrum for a digital application. Now, there's a lot of different visual file types that are out there. Just four to touch on are JPEGs, PNGs, TIFF files, and EPS files. Now, JPEGs, PNGs, and TIFFs are all similar in that they are all what are called bitmap files. And that means that an image in this file type is composed of a grid. So if you zoomed in very close on a JPEG image or a PNG or a TIFF, you would see what its essence is, looks like graph paper, just squares all stacked up. And a computer understands the image by looking at each individual square and saying, this one's black, this one's blue, this one's green. EPS files, on the other hand, are what are called vector-based files. EPS files look at artwork as curves, as math. So instead of seeing individual pixels, individual dots, it sees it as shapes that are defined mathematically. The great thing about EPS files or other vector-based files is that they are infinitely scalable. Since you're not looking at individual squares, but you're thinking of curves as math, you can have something be as large as you want and you don't lose any of the quality in the imagery. Whereas bitmap files like JPEGs, PNGs, and TIFFs, if you don't have enough resolution, if you don't have enough dots there to begin with, and you make the image too big, you're gonna lose the quality. All right, a couple more things to think about. JPEGs can be very small files, but that's also because they are what are called lossy files. And that means that when JPEGs are saved, they get compressed down and some of the digital information actually drops out. So if you have a JPEG that's been saved over and over, you can actually end up with a file that's maybe conveniently small or seemingly so, but the image quality has really degraded. PNGs and TIFFs, most TIFFs, on the other hand, are lossless files. They retain all of the quality in there. TIFFs can be much larger than JPEGs for that reason, but you're also going to get higher image quality. Now, JPEGs and TIFFs can both be used either for print or for digital applications. PNGs are digital only. They shouldn't be used for print ever. And EPS files or other vector formats can be used for print or for online. You might have heard about resolution. The two numbers to mostly keep in mind are that if you're doing something in print, you want to have at least 300 DPI or dots per inch for your image at the final size that it's going to reproduce to be able to have good clarity. If you're doing something in a digital only application, you have a lot more flexibility and you only need a minimum of 72 DPI. All right, speaking of imagery, what do you do if you're thinking about how you want to incorporate imagery into your work? I definitely recommend that you consider the tone and the purpose. Something that you might put on the cover of a publication should probably have a different approach to it than a small image that you have within the body of a piece. I like to think of different images as in terms of snapshots versus photographs to help make this distinction. A snapshot is an image that hopefully is formally beautiful, but the content within the image, the data, the visual data that it contains is kind of the most important thing. Whereas a photograph can be maybe more dramatic, more poetic. Think of it as something that might be on the wall of a gallery. And so depending on your application for different imagery, consider which way you want to go. Now, a question that I get a lot is, where can I get a really great image that I don't have to pay anything for? You get what you pay for. And if possible, I would say go for the imagery that is out there that's available at a cost, and there's a reason for that cost. I mean, you wouldn't go to your doctor and ask for treatment for free. But having said that, I do understand that there are times that there are simply limitations. And so there are some options. One thing to keep in mind is that an image that is owned by a .gov or a .mil site is public domain and free to use. And that's because US taxpayer dollars have already paid for it. So we pay our taxes, we've already paid for these images, they're free for us to use. One exception, and something that you should keep in mind, is that if there is an image that is posted to a .gov or a .mil site that wasn't created by that agency, that maybe came from a stock imagery source, it's not public domain, it's not free to use. And there are some really good image libraries out there that you can access through this. NASA is a perfect example of that. NASA's image library, it's .gov. Everything is free to use and public domain. And as you can imagine, it's some really spectacular imagery. Now, if you do have the ability to pay for some imagery, there's some tiers that you can think about. iStock Photo is a really great example of a stock image house that has quite good quality imagery at quite economical prices. Getty Images is kind of a tier up, and Getty actually owns iStock. Getty Images will cost you more, but the quality is also going to be better. And there are also some really excellent sources of scientifically specific imagery. Two of my favorites are Visuals Unlimited and Science Source. Now, these are going to be stock sites that are going to be more expensive, but the quality is quite extraordinary. And frankly, you're going to be able to find specific scientific images that you wouldn't be able to find in your more commercial stock sites. And whatever imagery you use, please be conscious of rights and permissions. I wish that I could say that this quote here was made up. Sadly, it's not. And sadly, I've heard it on multiple occasions. Just because something is out there doesn't mean that everybody has the right to grab it and repurpose it for their own uses. And please always give credit where it's due. Okay, let's talk about word clouds. Word clouds are very popular, and I understand why. They're visual, they're fun. The thing with word clouds is that I generally recommend that they not be used. And the reason is that most word clouds that you will see out there, while it's something visual, it doesn't actually convey an information in a way that's useful. And that's because most word clouds don't have a lot of difference in the sizes of the words in them. You end up with something that doesn't have a lot of visual hierarchy. It becomes visual cacophony. It's the equivalent of being in a room with 100 people, all of whom are speaking at the same time, at the same volume, and nothing stands out. So one exception to this, because there are always exceptions to rules, was this cover that we did for a special issue for Science Magazine. Shockingly, this is a special issue about data. We took all of the content of the special issue itself and stripped out small words like A, like V, like of, and we were left with about 60,000 unique words and used them to create this word cloud. The reason that it visually works and that it serves to convey information is because there is a very strong visual hierarchy. All right, I know I've thrown a lot at you so far. I did tell you I was going to do that. So I wanted to take a moment and just let everybody stop and kind of think, all right, here are some things that I might have done this way in the past, and in the future, I might do them differently. Okay, let's move on. So what next? Let's talk about audience engagement. When you're engaging an audience member, how do you make them feel that whatever you're sharing with them matters to them? One really great tool to do this is storytelling. Now, why storytelling? Storytelling humanizes. And at the end of the day, the human element is at the core of everything that we're doing in science and science communication. Science is done by humans for humans. Even if it's something like astrophysics, where no human will ever have any tangible connection to it, it's still an increase of knowledge. The human element is at the core of it all. So if you can have that human connection, make that human connection. If you can have it be a visual connection, do it. Have your audience feel connected. And I don't mean to suggest that you do this in any way that is emotionally manipulative or that tugs at heartstrings inappropriately. It can be fun, it can be whimsical. But having a human connection visually or any other way can be a very, very powerful communication tool. In your visual communications, embrace simplicity. We talked about this some already, about having design for scientific communication be kind of an invisible undercurrent. Sometimes you can embrace humor in this as well. And sometimes you can do them together. My favorite example of this is something called Upgoer 5. Upgoer 5 was created by the brilliant Randall Munroe, who is the cartoonist of the webcomic XKCD. Randall decided to give himself a little experiment to see if he could communicate very, very technical information in a very accessible way. So he took the schematic of the Saturn V rocket and he redrew it and he relabeled it using only the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language. More accurately, he did it using only the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language, because 1,000 is not one of the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language. The result was something very funny, very accessible. The humor helped to really break down boundaries. But at the end of the day, it also proved a very, very serious point. And that is that you can take even the most complex technical information and communicate it in ways that everybody can access. So Upgoer 5 has become a bit of a phenomenon. There are now Upgoer 5 sessions at scientific conferences around the world where researchers communicate their own research using only the 1,000 most commonly used words in the English language. It becomes uproariously funny, but it also proves a very, very serious point about sharing very technical information in a very accessible way. And if this is something that you're interested in, there are sites online that you can Google where you can plug in an abstract and see if it fits in with the 1,000 most commonly used words. And you can edit it around until you get to something quite spectacular. So bear in mind, there's a lot of power in simplicity in a lot of different ways, a lot of different levels. You want to simplify the jargon. We've all heard that when in science writing, you want to simplify the jargon, and research communication, you want to simplify the jargon. That's the case for the visual communication as well. Keep in mind that collaging is not necessarily a good thing. In fact, I would say more often than not, just resist the urge entirely. There can be a desire to just throw everything at something and seemingly make it more powerful that way. It actually has the opposite effect. You end up watering everything down. More is not more. An example that I like to share about this is Ardipithecus ramidus. Ardipithecus ramidus was one of the most important paleontological discoveries of our time, or of any time really. There was a fossil sample skeleton that was discovered and was known of in the paleontological community for 14 years before the research was published. The science team wanted to make sure that they did everything thoroughly and accurately. They didn't want to have any stone left unturned, so it took 14 years. And consequently, there was 14 years worth of anticipation and 14 years worth of buildup for the researchers and for the science community as a whole. Now, when the research was finally published, which was during my tenure at Science, there was a lot of discussion between me and the editorial team and the research team about how we would present this work on the cover of the journal. There were going to be pages and pages and pages within the journal with the research papers, with all of the details there. And there was a push by some people to have the visual equivalent of 14 years worth of anticipation and 14 years worth of excitement and buildup on the cover. There was a push to have just a big whole lot of stuff. But at the end of the day, it was 14 years worth of buildup that at the core were about this one fossil specimen. And so that's what ended up on the cover. And that simplicity made for a so much more dramatic and powerful image than it could have been otherwise. When you're thinking about imagery, also consider your tone, consider the purpose. Think back to the questions that you were asked yourself at the beginning. What is my message? Who is my audience? The content might be something that's very dire and deserves something that's quite serious. It might be something that's still very technical information, but can maybe be presented in a more lighthearted, whimsical way that thus becomes more inviting as well. Can you create a story arc with your visuals? You might have just one slot for some kind of an image, but can you use that to introduce a narrative? Can you have a cartoon maybe, or an infographic? Or there will be times that you just have one image and that's what's going to work. But in that case, can you have it be as strong of an image as possible? Keep in mind the things that you might think of as limitations oftentimes are not. This is the interior of a book that I designed for the Woodrow Wilson Center Press in conjunction with Johns Hopkins University Press. This book was about religious sects in Russia and the Ukraine in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And the prime characteristic of these religious sects was they had a very, very deep, strong connection with the land. Now, this book on paper, if you pardon the pun, had limitations. It had to be 6 by 9 inches. It had to be one column. It had to be one color. But by making adjustments to the design, by having wider margins top and bottom, by having narrower margins side to side, by having running feet instead of running heads, by having the folios at the bottom of the pages, by doing these things, what was created was a sense of landscape across the spread that echoed back to the content of the book. Now, this is something that 99% of people reading the book would not have picked up on, and I would not have expected them to, but it is something that subconsciously reinforces the messaging. When you're communicating visually, consider color. Can you use color to set a mood? Can you use color to reflect subject matter? Can you use color to take subject matter that might be a little dense and off-putting and unwelcoming and put a more inviting, friendly spin on it? One thing that's very important to consider when you consider color is to consider those who cannot. 1 in 12 men has some form of color vision deficiency or color blindness. 1 in 200 women has this. Statistically, there are people watching this webinar who have some form of color vision deficiency. So consider that. This is a rare slide where I'm not going to give a credit, and that's because I don't want to shame anybody or put anybody on the spot. But this is a figure from a published research paper. On the left is the original figure, and on the right are 2 simulations showing what this figure would look like to people with the 2 most common forms of color blindness. There is a lot of color used in scientific data, and especially in biomedical research. I know that I'm not going to be able to change that. I don't expect to. I'd love it if I could. I know it's not going to happen, but I'd like to raise awareness of this as a problem so that people know, and so that people maybe become more conscious that if there are ways of not relying solely on color to share data and to communicate data visually, that that's a good thing. So always design accordingly. Don't rely just on color. And always employ color vision deficiency simulation tools. There are a lot of them out there. Adobe Creative Suite has these built in to Photoshop and to Illustrator, but there are also free tools available online, including Color Oracle and this site through colorblindness.com. Likewise, if you're designing, especially for online applications, it's a really good idea to test the contrast of your colors to make sure that if you want to have this blue text against this brown background, that there's enough contrast between there so that the work is accessible to as great a proportion of the population as possible. And the last URL that you see there is an example of a tool like this, where you can actually take the numbers and plug them in and see if you have enough contrast and adjust accordingly. All of these concepts that we've talked about, I would urge you to apply to graphical abstracts, which have become really popular in the last few years, and for great reason. One thing that sometimes becomes problematic with graphical abstracts is people trying to put too much in there. Think of a graphical abstract as a visual elevator speech and pare it down accordingly. This is an example of one that I find very successful because it conveys a lot of information, but conveys it very succinctly and very clearly. Okay, I want to talk about metaphor for a moment. Metaphor is a very powerful tool in writing, in written communication. So when I was a kid, my dad got me a subscription to Omni magazine for my birthday one year. And there was an article in there about black holes. And the article said that if you found yourself at the edge of a black hole and somehow miraculously you were alive and conscious, that it would feel like you were holding on to the edge of the Golden Gate Bridge with half of the population of Canada hanging off of your ankles. It's a powerful metaphor. It's one that has stayed with me for decades. Another example, more recent, related to the Mars Curiosity rover. At a press briefing about the rover, a NASA press officer was talking about the landing site for the rover and how accurately they had hit their target. There was an elliptical zone that was the overall landing zone, and there was one spot within that ellipse that was kind of like the bullseye that they were aiming for. And when describing how close they got to that bullseye, the press officer said, imagine you're in Tokyo, Japan, and you hit a golf ball, and you're aiming for one specific window on the Empire State Building, and you hit the next window over. That's how close they got. And that metaphor became a very understandable way of thinking about something that might be a little bit difficult to comprehend otherwise? Well, you can have visual metaphor as well. There is a concept in physics called the Lamb shift. Now, I could not for the life of me explain to you in scientific terms what the Lamb shift is. But I can tell you that a way of thinking about it visually is if you have a single object that is reflected infinitely through two almost parallel mirrors. And so that's what we used to convey it on the cover. That's a visual metaphor that everybody can understand and relate to, and that makes something that's a very technical, maybe intimidating topic feel more approachable and more welcoming. So I invite you all in your own work to explore visual metaphor. I imagine some of you might be thinking, well, no, I'm not a visual person, I can't do that. Well, you can do that, and I have news for you. You already do that, and you do it literally in your sleep. Unless you are one of the rare people who dreams only literally, who dreams about washing the dishes, and it's a dream about washing the dishes, then you already do think in terms of visual metaphor. Maybe you have a dream about a one-room schoolhouse out in a backwood canyon, but you just know that it's actually your childhood home, and there's a stray dog at the back door, but you know it's your second grade teacher. So you already do think in terms of visual metaphor, and I hope that that knowledge that you already have, that skill within you, will inspire you to explore this further. So again, I've thrown a lot at you, so I want to just take a minute to let you think, all right, here's something that maybe I can be more a little conceptual in my thinking about. All right, and let's get back to that question that we had from the start. How many spaces should there be after a period? So some people insist that it's 1, some people insist that it's 2. People who said anything otherwise, I know you're just being silly, and anybody who thinks that it doesn't matter, I think by now you've heard me talk enough about this to know that I do think that it matters. So here's the thing, for people who said that 1 space is correct, or for people who said that 2 spaces is correct, guess what? You're both correct, but you're both correct at different times in history. At the time that we're at in history now, 1 space after a period is correct, and I'm going to explain to you why. Back in the day, when we used typewriters, we had what is called monospace type, where every character had the same amount of real estate as every other character. So something that was a wide character like an M would take a lot of that real estate, whereas a narrow character like an I would have just a little bit of the real estate and more padding side to side. Nowadays, we have modern typesetting, modern word processing, and we use variable width type where each character just uses the amount of real estate that it actually needs. So if you said 2 spaces is correct and you still use an old typewriter, then you get dispensation. You can still use 2 spaces. Because for those old typewriters with monospace type, 2 spaces after a period is correct and necessary. Since we have some characters that have a lot of room around them and some that have a little, we end up with strange spacing within words, and because of that, you need more space after a sentence to let the eye know, okay, this is it, this is the stop now. Nowadays, we don't need that anymore. We have modern word processing, modern typesetting, and a single space is appropriate. A double space actually hinders readability. It becomes a little bit of like a hiccup for the eye. Now, there was a paper that was published last year that seemingly refuted this. The researchers of this paper took samples of text and they had subjects read it, and they used eye tracking technology to follow how people's eyes were going along the lines of text and where they might stop. And the research showed that 2 spaces after a period was correct. However, the study was deeply flawed, and honestly, I don't understand how it made it through peer review. The problem is that the researchers used the typeface Courier to set these samples of text. Courier is a monospaced typeface. Courier is the typeface that you see at the top of your screen right now. So using that for a study, 2 spaces is correct. That's what it should be used. But we don't use monospace type in our communications in modern day. So 1 space is correct. Okay, we're going to move on to Q&A shortly. But first I wanted to just leave you with one parting thought. And that's that hopefully I've convinced you at least a little bit that good design isn't a luxury or an extravagance. It's really a necessity for good communication. And it's not just about making things look good. It's about conveying information in the best possible way. Hopefully I have shared some things with you that will help you in your own communication. But I will also urge you that if you have the opportunity to collaborate with others in your visual communication. I'm guessing you already do a lot of collaboration in your day-to-day work. And hopefully you can also collaborate some on the visual side, be it collaborating with other scientists, with designers, with illustrators, with photographers. And you can really have a lot of back and forth, a lot of good ideas going, and hopefully prove what I believe to my core, which is that the best work is born of collaboration. All right, with that, I'd like to thank you. And we're now going to go to some questions. So bear with me for just a moment, and we will take a look. All right, we have a question asking if the recommendations for DPI, or dots per inch, if that's appropriate for data reproduction as well, such as for a graph. So I would say yes, depending on how it is reproduced. If it's a graph that is reproduced as a bitmapped file, like a TIFF or a PNG or a JPEG, then you want that high resolution. If you have the option of creating a graph in a vector-based program, like Illustrator, and having it as an EPS, you're gonna get the most crisp, clear clarity. All right, there's another question about PNG files. If you want transparent backgrounds, can PNG files be used for print products if the DPI is higher? It's not really best practice. There are ways of using other files that can still give you the transparency. If you can use, again, vector-based files, those are going to be great. You can use other files that are specifically print-based and use the transparency with that. All right, here's a fun question. Somebody wanted to know what the main typeface or font was that I used in the slides. That's a typeface called Myriad. Another question, what's the website you mentioned, which has a list of the most common words in English? So I don't recall the name of the website itself where you can go and do this test, but it's, if you Google UpGoer 5, which is the UpGoer 5 translation for the Saturn V rocket, you can find these tools. And the UpGoer 5 comic itself, you can find at xkcd.com. All right, another question. Can you talk more about how to go about approaching a visual abstract? That is, how do I figure out what's most important? The best tool that I have found for this might sound contradictory. I have found that it's actually talking it through. So you'll recall that I said that a visual abstract becomes kind of like a visual elevator speech. So if you're trying to do your visual abstract, talk about your research with a colleague. See if you can get it into that little pithiness. Can you explain your abstract in 30 seconds or so? And then maybe start brainstorming some visuals that play off of that. I hope so. All right, here's a great question. Are you a proponent of STEAM rather than STEM education, especially for K through 12? So STEM, of course, being science, technology, engineering, and math. And there's been a real push over recent years of having, rather than STEM, having it be STEAM education, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. And I'm absolutely a proponent of this. I think that there's a lot of crossover between art and science and math. As Jamie mentioned this at the start, I started thinking that I was going to go into science. I was very science focused. I was very math focused. And even though I went into the arts, there's a very analytical component of that that ties back in. So I'm absolutely a proponent of STEAM education. A question about if I'm familiar with Edward Tufte on the visual presentation of information. Absolutely. You might even be able to see some of his books in the bookcase there behind me. Edward Tufte is a great resource. There's way too much of a rich amount of subject matter there to touch on now. So I'm just going to put his name out there for people to look into if you're interested. He's really one of the gurus about information visualization, and it's Edward Tufte, T-U-F-T-E. Okay, a question about if I'm a proponent of scientists doing their own visual communication or if I favor them working with illustrators and designers. Personally, I think that when you're able to have subject matter experts working together, you're going to get the best possible product. So I'm always going to be a proponent of having a professional designer or professional illustrator working alongside of scientists and really having that collaboration. And if you're able to have it be a truly collaborative process and not just have a scientist say, okay, I want you to do X, Y, Z, but rather, here's what I want to convey. Can you help me think through some ways to do that? I do believe personally that that's going to give you the best possible result. Having said that, I also realize that that's not always possible due to funding constraint, due to other constraints. So in that case, I hope that some of the things that I've shared with you today might help you to improve your own visual communications if you're working on them. Okay, here's a question. How do you get an artist or other creative talent participating earlier in the research process to help shape the story? How do you balance attracting and delighting readers with paring down to what is necessary to communicate? What are some resources and ideas for picking color schemes for scientific visualization, except for being mindful about color blindness and contrast? Hey, that was a lot of questions, but some nice ones there. In terms of how to get people participating earlier, I would say just try to broaden your networks and reach out to your networks. Let people know that this is something that you're interested in pursuing. If you're based in a university setting, maybe reach out to art departments and see if there's some way of having some collaboration there. In terms of how to balancing attracting and delighting readers with paring down to what's necessary to communicate, always keeping in mind that for scientific visual communication, the content is the most important thing. Flashy visuals aren't the most important thing. So make sure that you're always going back through and checking, double checking that you're doing whatever you can to have the content come first and not having the visuals become almost too important that they become distracting. And then the question about some resources for picking color schemes. There are some great sources out there. I'm sorry that I didn't include any in the slides here, but I think if you just Google scientific illustration color palette, there's a really good website or two that will pop up. Okay, what activities would I suggest for undergraduates or new grad students who don't consider themselves visual designers? I'd say one thing is just to trust yourself, to believe that you do have what it takes, at least to get started, and to lean on people either whose work you admire or who you respect, or if there are specific designers or art people that you can use to bounce ideas off of, those can be really nice resources. This is a great question. How do you decide when to simplify, when to clarify? I would say more often than not, simplify further than you think that you need to. There is, like I said before, there is oftentimes this impulse to throw visual stuff at it, thinking that that's going to improve things, but oftentimes it just obfuscates what you're trying to communicate. So I would say pare down more and more. If you find that you've pared down too much and your message isn't getting through anymore, you can always dial it back and add some things back in. Okay, what are some charts that can replace pie charts? Oh, that's a good question. The questioner says, I like that pie charts can emphasize pieces of a whole, but they are notoriously hard for the viewer to compare the sizes of the pieces of the pie. That's very true. If you can, I would say actually include the data along with the chart if you do have to have a pie chart so that people have a numerical reference as well. Beyond that, I would say that there actually, if this is another thing that Edward Tufte is very helpful with, and if you can do some playing around with a lot of the graphing tools that are available through Illustrator, I think that you'll find that there's some really nice options in there. And don't always feel that you have to use the same kind of chart for every kind of data, that whatever is best for each particular data set is going to be appropriate. Okay, oh, this is a fascinating question about the cultural way of viewing. Sorry, bear with me just a minute here. Okay, sorry, I'm back on track now. All right, the cultural way of reading visually. For example, how in Japan, things are read from top to bottom, or things being read from right to left, such as in Arabic or in Hebrew, and in Western languages, we read from left to right. How should different cultures be taken into account for visual communication? That's a great question. I don't know that I have a cut and dried answer. If you have something that you know is being communicated specifically to one audience like that, that you can bear that in mind. Unfortunately, I would say that English does become the universal language of scientific communication. So you might need, if you know you don't have a very narrow specific audience, you might need to err towards the Western way of doing things. Are there great programs for, or software with templates for flyers or PowerPoint? Absolutely. If you're using Adobe Creative Suite, there are some nice ones out there. I will confess, I'm not actually a big user of PowerPoint. I'm an InDesign gal. I do things in InDesign and then I export it to a PDF. But I believe PowerPoint does have some nice things in there. Just remember to steer clear of the too many bells and whistles and effects and crazy things. Okay, good examples of graphical abstracts. That's another thing that I hate to throw it back to Google, but I would honestly, there's a lot out there. If you just do a Google image search for graphical abstract or visual abstract, and just kind of start looking around and playing around a little bit, see what speaks to you and what resonates with you. Okay, and then here's another question. If people were going to be able to get the slides afterwards. And yes, I do believe that we are recording this webinar and it will be available on the Alda Center website. So you'll be able to go back through there and get all of the resources from that. Okay, I am going to thank you all again tremendously for your time and attention, and I'm going to turn things back over to Jamie.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. We are so happy to have you here, and that was really wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jamie, and thank you, everybody.
This webinar and other Alda Center online learning opportunities have been made possible in part by the Kavli Foundation. Sign up to receive the Alda Center's newsletter and explore our webinars, online communication trainings, and workshop offerings at the links below.